A wounded cowboy, barely clinging to life, pointed a trembling hand straight at the richest man in town, accusing him of crimes no one dared to speak aloud. The townspeople froze, the saloon's doors swinging in the silence, as the sheriff tightened his grip on the stolen deeds that could burn the entire town to the ground. And standing in the middle of it all was Clara Whitmore, the woman they had already condemned without a trial. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The first storm of autumn roared over the sweeping plains like a living beast, clawing at the battered fences and hollowed trees that ringed the outskirts of Dry Creek. Above the horizon, black clouds boiled and churned, dragging the last pale strands of daylight into their churning bellies. The wind screamed across the open fields, rattling the shutters of a lonely cabin squatting at the edge of the woods like a forgotten prayer. Inside, Clara Whitmore worked methodically, her thin hands, scarred from years of hard work, moving in quiet rhythm as she fed wood into the stubborn fire. The cracked stone hearth threw flickering shadows across the single-room cabin. A narrow bed tucked against the wall, a worn table cluttered with sewing needles and scraps of muslin, a single chipped teacup steaming against the mounting cold. Clara's gray dress, hand-stitched and mended in more places than she could count, brushed softly against the plank floor as she moved. Her ash-brown hair, pinned hastily beneath a tattered shawl, caught the firelight, giving it a faint auburn glow. There was nothing glamorous about Clara, nothing delicate or gilded, but there was a kind of quiet stubbornness in the set of her mouth, a strength that came from seasons of surviving alone. The knock came so faintly at first, she thought it was the wind. But when it came again, a hollow, desperate sound, Clara froze, a log still in her hands. Her heart thudded once, sharply, against her ribs. In Dry Creek, visitors at dusk rarely brought good news. Cautiously, she set the wood down, wiped her palms on her apron, and crossed the room. The door creaked open against the force of the storm, and there he was, a man barely upright, his tall frame slumped against the threshold like a scarecrow unmoored by the gale. His sandy hair clung wetly to his forehead, and a battered tan duster, soaked and heavy, drooped from his shoulders. Beneath the brim of a hat askew on his head, his face was a patchwork of bruises and blood, his jaw clenched against some deep, gnawing pain. A wide, ugly gash ran down his left side, slicing through his shirt in a brutal crimson tear. Clara didn't hesitate. Hooking her arms beneath his, she heaved him inside with a grunt, the strain pulling at muscles hardened from chopping wood and hauling water. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the howl of the storm like a blade. With practiced urgency, she lowered him to the floor near the fire. His skin was clammy under her fingers, fever already setting in. She stripped away his sodden coat, peeled back the bloodied shirt, and began cleaning the wound with water she had warmed earlier. His body flinched under her touch, but he didn't wake. Her mind whirred even as her hands remained steady. A stranger meant trouble. A wounded stranger meant questions. Questions Clara had no good answers for. In a town like Dry Creek, a woman living alone was suspicion enough. Shelter a dying man and you were guilty before you spoke a word. Still, she couldn't turn him out. She wouldn't. Hours passed in quiet labor, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the low, broken murmurs of the man slipping in and out of fevered dreams. At one point, his eyes fluttered open, green, sharp despite the haze, and his voice, rough as gravel, escaped his cracked lips. "Name's Luke Archer," he rasped, before slipping back into unconsciousness. Clara sat back on her heels, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. She studied his face, the stubborn set of his jaw, the kind of features that spoke of someone who had fought too hard and lived too little. A part of her knew the moment she pulled him over her threshold that her life would not be the same. Outside, hidden among the skeletal trees, someone lowered a pair of binoculars, the glass catching the last glint of fading light. The figure turned away, their boots muffled by the wet earth. By sunrise, the whole town would know. Clara Whitmore had taken in a man the law wasn't asking questions about. And in Dry Creek, mercy was a crime all its own. The first gray light of morning crept over Dry Creek, washing the town in a colorless haze. Mist clung low to the ground, shrouding the dirt roads and tilting buildings in a ghostly pall. It should have been a quiet dawn, the kind where the clatter of a lone milk wagon or the sleepy crow of a rooster stirred life into the day. Instead, an electric tension pulsed through the streets like a warning. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Clara Whitmore had a man holed up in her cabin. A wounded stranger. An outlaw, they said. A threat. By the time the sun fully breached the horizon, Dry Creek was bristling with a self-righteous fury that needed only the thinnest excuse to boil over. The knock at Clara's door that morning wasn't a knock at all. It was a pounding, a demand. She opened it slowly, feeling the scrape of the wood against the floorboards like the rasp of a blade being drawn. On the threshold stood Sheriff Walter Griggs, 58 years old, his salt and pepper hair combed back from a forehead lined deep with years of suspicion and small-minded bitterness. His tan deputy's coat was pressed sharp against his barrel chest, his polished boots dusted only lightly by the town's rising dirt. Beside him loomed Deputy Carter, a lanky man in his 20s with eyes too eager for cruelty, and Deputy Simmons, older, heavier, his mouth twisted in a grimace that might have once been doubt, but hardened now into duty. The morning sun glanced off their badges, twin mirrors of cold authority. "You're under investigation, Miss Whitmore," Griggs said, his voice flat as iron left in the sun, "for aiding a fugitive." Clara's hands gripped the doorframe. She felt the accusation slide into her chest like a blade. "A fugitive?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, disbelieving. Griggs's lips curled into a sneer. He tilted his head, mock gentle. "You'll tell that to the judge," he said, and behind him, Carter chuckled low in his throat. They didn't wait for an answer. Griggs pushed the door wider and stepped inside without permission, his boots thudding across her floor like the stomp of a coming sentence. In town, tongues flapped with ravenous delight. At the Silver Spur Saloon, poker hands paused mid-play as rumors twisted into truths. They said the stranger had shot a rancher dead in Laramie. They said Clara had harbored him for weeks, nursing him out of love, or worse, for a price. They said it all with the conviction of people who had been waiting for her to fall, sharpening their words like knives on stone. No one knocked on Clara's door to ask the truth. No one remembered the bread she had delivered to widowed mothers, the quilts she had stitched for winter charity drives, the children she had nursed through fever when no doctor dared cross the flooded river. None of that mattered now. Neighbors she had once called friends turned their faces to the windows when she passed. Women pulled their skirts aside as she walked by, shielding their children like she carried disease. Men spat into the dirt near her boots but never met her eyes. And every slammed door, every whispered slur, every hastily drawn curtain was another stone in the wall rising around her. In Dry Creek, guilt wasn't decided by evidence. It was decided by fear, and Clara's independence, her refusal to cower, had made her a stranger long before Luke Archer had ever darkened her doorway. Now, the sentence was clear. She would stand alone, just as she always had. But now the whole town would be there to watch her fall. The fever broke on the third day, but not before dragging Luke Archer through its ragged hell. Clara sat at his bedside through it all, sponging his forehead with water turned lukewarm by the hour, her own hands trembling more from the weight of decisions than exhaustion. She didn't pray. She hadn't done that in years. But in the cold slivers of pre-dawn light, she wished, wordless, desperate wishes, for strength, for clarity, for the storm outside her cabin to break before it drowned them both. When Luke finally stirred, it was with a rattling cough that racked his battered body. His hand, still slick with fever sweat, grasped weakly at the thin quilt covering him. His eyes fluttered open, no longer clouded but sharp, cutting, alive, piercing green, like new leaves against dry bark. "I didn't kill nobody," he rasped, voice shredded but urgent. His fingers curled slightly in the blanket, clenching it as if the truth alone might anchor him. "They shot me because I said no." Clara leaned in, absorbing every broken syllable like they were sacred. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had known. Some deep, stubborn part of her had known from the beginning that there was more to this than gossip and cowardice. Luke's story spilled out in jagged bursts, each word a stone he had carried too long. He had worked at McGraw's ranch. Victor McGraw, the man who sat atop Dry Creek like a king atop a crumbling throne. Luke had seen the forged deeds with his own eyes, had heard the threats whispered over whiskey and cigars, homesteaders bullied off their land, their claims swallowed by McGraw's vast empire with a legal smile and a handshake slick with lies. When Luke refused to stay silent, when he said he'd ride to the county seat and tell the marshals what he knew, they shot him, left him for the buzzards. But Luke hadn't died. And now Clara understood. She hadn't merely harbored a wounded man. She had stepped, blindly, stubbornly, between a predator and his prey. The weight of it sat heavy in her chest, but it did not crush her. It ignited something older, something harder. A memory of standing alone against prairie winds, of digging graves with her bare hands because no one else would. She didn't waver. At the edge of town, the wagon groaned under Luke's weight as Clara helped him up, bundling him carefully in the thick quilts her mother once sewed when winters were cruelest. His breath was shallow, his strength more spirit than muscle, but his resolve burned steady as a blacksmith's forge. The road into Dry Creek stretched out before them, coated in dust that clung to the wheels and the hems of Clara's dress. Every slow turn of the wagon's wheels was a drumbeat, a dare. Heads poked from shop windows, murmurs rose like startled birds. At the saloon's porch, Sheriff Griggs lounged like a cat fat on expectation, his mouth already twitching into a satisfied sneer. He tipped his hat mockingly as Clara pulled the wagon to a stop. Victor McGraw himself leaned lazily against a post, a glass of whiskey dangling from his fingers, arrogance draped over him like a fine coat. It was McGraw Luke saw first. His hand, battered but steady, lifted from beneath the quilt and pointed, trembling but sure. "That's the real outlaw," Luke said, his voice thin but carrying through the stunned silence. "I seen him steal what wasn't his, and I got the papers to prove it." Gasps and whispers rippled through the gathered crowd. Clara's hand tightened around the packet she carried. Old deeds, stained and crumpled but deadly sharp as any blade. Proof hidden away in Luke's coat, discovered during one long sleepless night when she had stitched both flesh and hope together with blood-stained fingers. In that moment, under the hard glare of a midday sun, the ground under Dry Creek shifted. And the people, for the first time, looked away from Clara and toward the real monster standing among them. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint creak of leather as Victor McGraw shifted against the porch rail, his lazy smile curdling into something darker. His whiskey glass tilted, the amber liquid catching the sunlight as if even it hesitated to fall. Around him, the gathered townsfolk stood rooted to the dirt, the dust swirling at their boots forgotten. Luke's voice, though hoarse, rang with the finality of a death knell. "I got the proof," he repeated, his hand not wavering despite the effort it cost him. Clara stepped forward, the worn packet clutched tightly against her chest. She moved through the crowd without bowing her head, the battered papers held like a torch. When she reached Sheriff Griggs, she didn't offer a word. She simply thrust the deeds into his hand and stared at him with a gaze so cold it might have frozen the desert air. Griggs thumbed through the documents, his frown deepening with each page. The signatures, the dates, the mismatched seals. It was all there. Black and white proof of McGraw's theft. Evidence Griggs could not bury without burying himself alongside it. Victor McGraw laughed once, a short, humorless bark, and tossed his empty glass at the wall where it shattered. "You think a few papers'll matter?" he sneered. "This town owes me." But the town was already shifting. Mothers who had clutched their children away from Clara now stepped closer, their faces pinched with something like shame. Farmers who had lost land they couldn't afford to lose narrowed their eyes. Men who had turned their backs began whispering to each other, the weight of stolen seasons pressing against their ribs. Griggs didn't look at Victor. He looked at the crowd and saw the verdict already written there. It took less than an hour. A formal arrest, witnessed by more townsfolk than had ever crowded the dusty main street before. No slick words or silver coins could buy McGraw a way out this time. His hands, once so quick to sign false deals, were shackled in full view of everyone he had cheated. Sheriff Griggs, pale beneath his tan, resigned before sunset. His badge surrendered without ceremony. Luke, still weak but upright now, leaned heavily against the wagon as Clara helped him down. His hand brushed hers, grateful, steady, alive. That night, Dry Creek's sky cracked open with the first true storm of winter. Rain fell hard, washing months of dust and resentment into the thirsty ground. Windows glowed with lamplight behind curtains drawn not in fear, but in privacy reclaimed. In her cabin, Clara sat beside the fire, listening to the thunder roll across the plains like an old hymn. Across from her, Luke rested, the color returning to his cheeks. Neither spoke much. There was no need. In the crackle of the flames, in the steady beat of the rain, in the way Clara no longer felt the town's judgment pressing against her windows, they found something better than victory. They found peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the harder peace of surviving with your name, your dignity, and your soul intact. And for the first time in a long while, when Clara closed her eyes against the warmth of the fire, she didn't dream of loneliness. She dreamed of tomorrow.